Well, welcome to episode 360 of 10-Minute Record Reviews. And this time I'm going to talk about this classic recording from 1958 by Ahmad Jamal, At The Pershing, subtitled But Not For Me. This record is a fascinating record. It's also a very important record historically, and I've relied in parts in this review on some great work done by a guy called Michael Mackey, who wrote a dissertation in 2017. And I put a link to that dissertation in the description below. If you're interested in the backstory of Ahmad Jamal, I totally recommend dipping into that. It was a massive success. It was one of the biggest selling jazz albums of all time. It's full of minimalist, airy tracks, which are anything but gritty or bluesy like a lot of the contemporary jazz was. And the question is that minimalism and airiness a good thing or a bad thing? Ahmad Jamal was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in July 1930. His birth name was Frederick Fritz Jones. He was a child prodigy from the age of 3. Unlike a lot of subsequently famous black jazz musicians from the era, he actually has a lot of access to formal musical education growing up. In 1948, at age 18, he gets his first serious jazz gig touring with George Hudson's big band. He then joins an outfit called the Four Strings. The Four Strings was a Pittsburgh-based quartet, which was led by a jazz violinist called Joe Kennedy. And although Jamal's tenure in the band only overlaps with Kennedy's for maybe a little less than a year, this was a hugely influential period for Jamal. Jamal was heavily affected by Kennedy's approach to arranging for small jazz combos. And this matters because Jamal's own contribution to jazz is very much about his approach to arranging. The Four Strings were quite popular with Jamal's addition. They were written up and downbeat, but they couldn't get a record deal, and they break up sometime around 1949-1950. At this point, with Jamal recently having gotten married, he and his wife decided to move to Chicago, which was her hometown. It wasn't an easy transition, however, because he ran into trouble with the Chicago Musicians Union. So for a while he was in limbo, and he ends up playing with a bit of a cabaret act called the Caldwells, who had this shtick where they sang and pretended to play their instruments, but had real musicians playing music behind them, and Jamal was one of those. Ironically, it ends up providing the fuel for one of his greatest ever compositions, which is called Ahmad's Blues, which is about the crappy time he was having playing with the Caldwells. And this challenging time when he first arrives in Chicago is also the time when, having been quite influenced by the Black Muslim movement in Detroit and Chicago, he converts to Islam and he takes the name Ahmad Jamal. He eventually gets his union card later in 1950 with the help of Eddie Johnson, the sax player, who wanted to get Jamal into his band. But what he really wanted was to lead his own group. That wasn't accessible right away, so he ends up being a sideman for a number of people, including the bassist Israel Crosby, who will show up later in this video, and he also got steady work with the sax player Vaughn Freeman. But eventually, by April 1951, he has enough of a head of steam to start his own trio, and he brings in 2 of his former colleagues from the Four Strings, the guitarist Ray Crawford and the bassist Tommy Sewell, and they rename themselves, drumroll, the Three Strings. Pretty soon, Sewell is replaced on bass by Eddie Calhoun, and this is the point where things start to take off for Jamal. They head off to New York, and they're heard at a club by the producer John Hammond, of course, of Columbia Records fame. And it's for OK Records that Hammond first records the Jamal Trio in the fall of 1951. The trio continues to prosper and grow in its reputation through the early 1950s. Jamal and Crawford are the constants, but the bass chair would rotate. Eventually, Israel Crosby, who had previously employed Jamal back around 1950, comes in to take the bass chair on a permanent basis by 1954. Over this period, the trio is starting to get more and more traction. In 1952, they play a Duke Ellington tribute concert at Carnegie Hall in New York, but success in terms of record sales was still kind of elusive. In 1956, they made an eponymous LP for Epic Records, which was also a Columbia sub-imprint, and another record the same year for the Chicago label Parrot called Ahmad Jamal Plays. Those hadn't ended up shifting too many copies, but in this period, probably a more important development was that Jamal had acquired a very influential and important admirer in the form of Miles Davis. Davis had been turned on to Jamal's sound by his sister, and he fell in love with his spacious, minimalist playing, which is so typical of Jamal's work, and the way that at the same time, despite being very parsimonious in his playing, he was still very lyrical. Davis bigged up Jamal in interviews, and it wasn't just talk either. He included something like a dozen of Jamal's own compositions in his own repertoire around the time. In 1956, Jamal's sound would change dramatically, although kind of by accident. That fall, his trio had a standing engagement at a supper club, kind of a ritzy place in Manhattan called the Embers. And although they were making pretty good money, Jamal hated playing there because everybody there was drunk, they were loud, they weren't listening to the music, it was not conducive to his art. And one night, this drunken guy lurches over to the piano and makes some song requests, and in doing so, spills his wine all over the keys. Jamal gets up, disgusted, and says, "Okay, guys, we're leaving." And he and Crosby head back to Chicago, but Ray Crawford, the guitarist, decides to stay in New York and make his bones there. So Jamal and Crosby head back to Chicago, and Jamal takes this as an opportunity to reinvent what he was doing. First of all, he's tired of bouncing around, so he cuts a deal with the Pershing Hotel, more on them later, to be their house band. And he also decides that he wants to hire a drummer instead of another guitar player. At first, he hires a drummer called Walter Perkins, but the guy he really wanted was another player called Vernel Fournier, who unfortunately at the time was otherwise engaged. With this new trio lineup of Crosby and Perkins, Jamal then starts to record for the Chess Brothers. Chess, of course, is a label which has so much to do with that amazing Chicago blues sound of the 1950s, but they also had a jazz imprint called Argo Records, and it's for Argo in the late fall of 1956 that Jamal's remade trio makes the LP Count 'em 88. As soon as that record is made, Jamal learns that Fournier is now available, so Perkins is out and Fournier comes in. Jamal, Crosby, and Fournier make one studio record in 1957, Ahmad Jamal Volume 4, which comes out the following year, but their big splash was just around the corner. The Pershing Hotel, no longer there sadly, was a music institution in Chicago. It had music on 3 floors. It had a big concert hall on the 3rd floor. It had smaller sized venues on the 2nd floor and a lounge on the ground floor. And it was in the lounge that Jamal had arranged to be the house band. Once the group had settled in at the Pershing, Jamal and his bandmates began to feel that they were really onto something, and somehow the vibe of the setting was taking them to new heights. So he told Leonard Chess of Chess Records that he wanted his next record to be a live recording at this venue. Chess likes the idea, and so they bring in the recording engineer Malcolm Chisholm to record the band at the venue. And over 4 nights, from the 16th to the 19th of January 1958, they record 43 separate tracks. From those 43 tracks, Jamal picks 8 tracks and he sequences the record himself. And the record was a huge hit. It sold 5,000 copies the first day in an era when if you moved 20,000 units, you had a big jazz record. It went on to sell something like 1 million copies. But despite all this, or maybe because of it, the critics hated it. Jamal plays a very good cocktail piano, meaningless upper keyboard improvisational tinkling, music which was emotionally, melodically, and organizationally innocuous. Now, Jamal's musical peers, Davis of course leading the pack, came to his defense, but many critics stuck to their view of Jamal as a lightweight for the rest of their careers. This record, as mentioned, is all standards, and side one starts with But Not For Me, which is commonly played in quite an upbeat way. Jamal's take is slowed down, it's minimalist. It really is, I think, kind of an inspired take. Crosby and Fournier are locked in. In fact, the sound of the rhythm section here is a huge part of what is appealing about this record, and it's not too surprising that this was very influential on Bill Evans, given what his trios would sound like and their focus on the rhythm section in the early 60s. Next track is Surrey with a Fringe on Top. Now, I gotta confess, I do find this song corny. It's kind of a personal preference, but I will say that this is the kind of lightweight stuff that the critics were certainly seizing on when they chose to basically rip this record back in the day. Moonlight in Vermont is a great example to point to if you're trying to demonstrate the linkage between Jamal and Davis. Music, 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 which is that Put Another Nickel in the Nickelodeon song, is another song I find kind of corny, but it does evolve into some very tight rhythmic playing later in the track. The side concludes with No Greater Love, which is another piece of what you might call high register minimalism. Side 2 starts with Poinciana, and this is, of course, the monster hit, the huge hit. It's nearly 8 minutes long. I do wonder if this had been the very first track, because it is so appealing and it is grittier than most of the other tracks in the record, whether the critics' attitudes might not have been a little bit different. The next track is the old jazz chestnut Wouldn't You. This is the track that really attracted Downbeat's ire in their review. To be honest, I kind of get the critique here. The final track is What's New, which is a nice piece of late night feeling jazz. Every now and then there's a jazz record that sells boatloads of copies that I just don't get. And for me, Exhibit A for that would be, for instance, Errol Garner's Concert by the Sea. This is another one which I find kind of puzzling. I'm not nearly as down on it as the contemporary critics were. I can see Miles's point, and there's lots of places here where there is that spaciousness and minimalism, which is really attractive. But do these tracks move me in the same way that Bill Evans's late 50s stuff does? Not so much. Later critics and scholars have largely come around to Miles's point of view and see this as a real landmark of the new minimalism around that time. I suspect that that view is somewhat colored by the great work that Jamal did later in his career, like, for instance, his album The Awakening for Impulse. But in any event, 65 years later, I don't know that I can hear either the triumph or catastrophe which led this to be such a polarizing record. And for me, it's 4 out of 5 stars.